Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Wednesday, everybody. First up, I wanted to cover a few points to supplement yesterday's coverage of China's stock market woes before moving on to the main story for today's video, China's UN Human Rights Review. Japanese financial media outlet Nikkei Asia writes today that Chinese gaming stocks surged after the regulator took down draft rules for gaming curbs. The draft had been removed from the official website of the National Press and Publication Administration, NPPA, China's gaming regulator, as of Tuesday morning. The move was somewhat unexpected, the outlet reports, as other ministries in similar situations have not removed draft regulations online in the past. This is another sign that the regulators may be backtracking on some of the more tough terms in the draft online gaming regulations that crashed game stocks the Friday before Christmas last year, which we followed at the time. Executives from leading gaming companies told Nikkei Asia that they were still expecting a finalized version of the draft rules, with one executive reportedly expressing, quote, "We have been in close contact with the authorities and we have been told that the final version will incorporate companies' feedback. The general direction of regulations is positive and Beijing is not trying to screw tech companies up." End quote. Meanwhile, the big news on the Chinese equities front is, of course, on Monday, as China's CSI 300 hit a 5-year low, stocks $6 trillion down from their heights in January 2021, and Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index down some 48% over the same period. The State Council signaled support for the market, and some media stories suggested that Beijing is considering about $280 billion in direct aid for the market. We of course covered this yesterday. While early trading on Tuesday indicated initial market excitement, this petered out somewhat by the end of the trading day, suggesting market skepticism. Indeed, in a piece today called "China's Bold Stock Market Rescue Plan Leaves Investors Skeptical," US-based Bloomberg writes, "It's hard to blame investors for their cynicism. China has a history of marshalling policy resources to support market bleeding, but few succeeded. During the 2015 rout, state funds reportedly spent an equivalent of $240 billion over the summer, but that didn't keep prices from falling again after the buying wound down." End quote. Michelle Lam, Greater China economist at Societe Generale, expressed, quote, "The 2015 experience shows that even when the government steps up buying, the rally is not necessarily sustainable unless we have a bigger stimulus package to address the economic issues." End quote. Other commentators argue that ultimately, even if the money is enough to support the market, it doesn't resolve any of the underlying issues that China is facing, such as restrictions from the US, the weak economy, unemployment, deflation, etc. The US-based Wall Street Journal, in an editorial today, further notes, quote, "The decline in Chinese stocks in recent years is symptomatic of deeper problems and no Canute-like command can fix. The economic rescue China really needs is for Mr. Xi to ease up on the party's political control of the economy." End quote. We make one further point before moving on from two observations. Quote, "Marshalling so much capital, if the Bloomberg report is correct, smacks of desperation. Makes me wonder if policymakers are worried about more than investors being unhappy. Like perhaps some big institutions, organizations are at risk of huge losses that could ripple through the financial system." End quote. And quote, "Xi Jinping's people are almost certainly telling him that the rout in the equity market is a stability risk. Investors aren't just abandoning Chinese stocks for normal reasons of valuation, but because the whole economic, policy and political environment has atrophied. Getting confidence back probably requires major changes in both." End quote. Next up, we move to our main topic for today, China's UN Human Rights Review. Just quickly though, if you're enjoying today's video, if you get some value from it, if you get value from China Update and you'd like to see the channel grow, I have a huge favor to ask. That is to like and subscribe. This is the best way to help the channel grow. About 45% of regular viewers are not subscribed. Just clicking these buttons helps the algorithm push this channel to new people. As the channel grows and is more financially sustainable, I hope to transition to doing this as my full-time work. Then I plan on making it an even better experience for everyone. For those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. This channel continues to primarily rely on subscribers like you rather than corporate sponsorship to be maintained. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Next up, we discuss China's United Nations Human Rights Review, which began on Tuesday, yesterday in Geneva. China faces this review of its human rights record every 5 years. Indeed, every UN member state undergoes a peer review of its rights record roughly every 5 years, conducted under the auspices of the UN's Human Rights Council. This year, Beijing has decided to come out swinging, marshalling long-standing partners like Russia and Belarus, as well as poorer nations which China has courted in recent years, to push the argument that actually it has a stellar human rights record and that the rights being pushed by Western countries are simply tools of oppression to keep China down and tar its good name. Chen Shu, for example, Beijing's envoy to the EU in Geneva, after the review concluded, expressed, quote, "We regret to note a few countries grossly accused and smeared China based not on facts, but on ideological bias and unfounded rumors and lies," end quote. The review, in a way, also reflects a schism over global geopolitics that has deepened at the UN in recent years, amid fierce and divisive conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, and the emergence of a Chinese-led anti-liberal Western bloc. Beijing, of course, has been playing the rhetorical game on its human rights record to its domestic audience for decades. But in recent years, it has presented these claims to an international audience with increased confidence, resources, and sophistication. Indeed, China File, a publication under the US-based Asia Society, published an article this week called "Beijing is Pouring Resources into its UN Human Rights Review." The piece explains that the review process not only involves an exchange in which representatives of the government under review make a presentation and answer questions from representatives from other governments, it also yields a set of recommendations made by other governments, which the government under review can accept or reject. Quote, "The efficiency of the review depends almost entirely on whether the governments engage in good faith." End quote. Chinese authorities, the China File piece argues, quote, "manipulate the process in several ways." End quote. First, and I'm using the article's words here, the national report is a work of fiction, straight from government officials and propaganda authorities. None of the grave human rights violations raised through other UN reviews or international civil society groups, from crimes against humanity to torture and rampant censorship, get a mention in Beijing's report. It asserts it is fostering historic achievements in the cause of human rights in China. The second tactic supports this deception. In clear violation of the guidelines, Chinese authorities prohibit independent civil society in the country from participating in drafting the report. Since China's 2018 report, Chinese officials have detained, disappeared, or driven into exile the environmentalists, feminists, lawyers, and other peaceful activists who could offer input. In 2013, Beijing authorities arbitrarily detained a human rights defender who was trying to travel to Geneva to learn about UN human rights procedures. She died in police custody in March 2014. Third, and I'm still quoting the piece directly here, Beijing works to ensure its allies offer up praise in their remarks at the dialogue. It also encourages these governments to make recommendations that are so vague as to make it easy for Beijing to accept them and claim progress. At China's 2018 review, Azerbaijan recommended that Beijing consider including measures aimed at ensuring the increased efficiency and accountability of public services. The network of Chinese human rights defenders, an independent human rights group, points out that some recommendations actually effectively endorse ongoing human rights abuses, such as Iran's proposing that Beijing safeguard its political system. We end the direct quote here. UK-based Reuters writes in an exclusive report that China has been lobbying non-Western countries to praise its human rights record ahead of the UN meeting. 4 diplomats reportedly told Reuters that China's mission to the United Nations in Geneva had been sending memos to envoys in the build-up to the review. quote, "An African diplomat, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirmed having received a request to show support for China at the meeting and said he would do as asked." End quote. One Caribbean nation, in its advance questions to the UN, quote, used a favoured phrase of Xi Jinping referring to China's whole process people's democracy and praising the fuller and more extensive and comprehensive democratic rights enjoyed in China. End quote. And so the battle lines were drawn on Tuesday. On one side, mostly Western and advanced Asian countries roundly criticized Beijing's, quote, serious human rights violations, end quote, in Xinjiang and Tibet, and urged it to repeal the national security law it had imposed on Hong Kong. The other side of nations praised China's poverty alleviation policies and others. Hong Kong's number 2 official, the chief secretary, travelled to Geneva to tell the audience of nations that the national security legislation had put Hong Kong, quote, back on track, end quote, adding, quote, with the implementation of the Hong Kong national security law and an improved electoral system, the days of social disturbance and fear are now over. End quote. We note that the major developing nations of India and Indonesia took the middle way in the review, making recommendations to Beijing while neither strongly praising or heavily criticizing China's record. State media has been publishing a number of articles praising China's stellar human rights record, and of course we look at them here not because we believe they are true necessarily, but because it's important that we examine how Beijing is articulating what it wishes to communicate domestically and internationally on these points. For example, the state-run Global Times writes today, quote, since the last review, China's ranking in the UN Human Development Index has continued to rise, demonstrating the advantages of China's modernization and human rights development paths. In the past 5 years, the human rights cause in China has made remarkable progress, particularly in areas of poverty alleviation and the successful fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. End quote. Of course, both of these claims are highly vulnerable to closer scrutiny. The piece then moves to the common second stage of these human rights claims, that is, human rights are actually Western rights and that Chinese rights are better. Quote, China has put forward 3 major initiatives on human rights, proposing to build a more just, fair and inclusive global human rights governance system. China's development-oriented human rights concept, compared to the Western liberal-based human rights perspective, is more inclusive and more in line with the current needs of global human rights governance. End quote. In a separate piece, the same outlet moved to the third stage, expressing, quote, inside and outside the UN conference site, our reporter noticed that overseas separatist forces and anti-China organizations were eager to infiltrate the venue, form alliances, and organize side meetings to conduct anti-China propaganda. This is also the latest part of Western anti-China forces' ongoing hype and pressure on the review concerning China. End quote. Thus, we see the 3-stage formula presented by Beijing. 1. China has a stellar human rights record. 2. There are Western-style human rights and Chinese-style human rights, and Chinese-style human rights are more appropriate for more nations. And 3. Claims that China has a poor human rights record are simply the efforts of malign actors seeking to tar China's image and prevent its rise. Like I said, China will likely continue to push this position internationally with increasing confidence and resources. This is the rhetorical front, part of an emerging China-led bloc in what could well become an increasingly fragmented order and geopolitical competition. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a good Wednesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.